So they were very aware that those people in positions of power were the ones that were perpetuating the violence, were the ones that were perpetuating the cycle of narcotráfico, and they were getting a lot from it themselves. We're not sure if they really understood this and saw, and were using it as resistant capital, or if they were just repeating what they were hearing at home from the parents. So this is something that we need to look further into.
And resistant capital means what?
Resistant capital means knowledge and skills cultivated through behavior to challenge inequality. Because they were saying stories about, well, yeah, but those people in positions of power are the ones who are perpetuating this. But we're not sure if they really understood that or if they were just repeating what the parents were saying. We also found a sense of responsibility towards families left behind. A lot of them saw themselves as having, like it was their duty to do good in school so that they could help those who were left in Juarez to come to the United States. One little girl, she's a U.S. citizen, and her family was in Juarez, and she was sharing with us, like, her whole family is waiting for her to turn 21 so that all of them, so that she can help the rest of them fix their immigration papers. They seem to want to do well in school. They see it as a sacrifice that the entire family is making, and this is Ms. A telling us this. It was a teacher, and she said, and in some way they feel the responsibility to respond well, to get good grades. It weighs on them to have to go back to their family and say that they got a bad grade or that they have to go to summer school. They use the knowledge they bring from home, the values their family has instilled in them, respect, paying attention, being polite, responsible, all those types of things. I see them trying to show that here in El Paso, so they were showing that in the schools, since they feel that in this way they're representing their family that is still in Juarez. So they saw themselves as, we have to do good for the family that is sacrificing their lives over there. And they also saw that life needed to continue. So almost kind of going back to your point, that they saw it as, okay, this is happening, but we still need to move on. We still need to keep living. And I think I have an example of that. I talk Rosa describing a car in which her uncle took her father to the hospital are indicative of her resilient resistance. She says, estaba todo sangrado, pero ya lo limpiaron. And so she talks about riding in the car and it was all full of blood, but they already cleaned it, so it's no big deal. We're still going to use the car. So the sense of, we need to move on, we need to keep living. Some of them talked about how they were going to go on the weekend to a quinceañera. Some of them talked about still going to the park, even though they were scared to death to go to the park, they still wanted to continue their life.
Valeria, huh?
Not the one that we have in this class.
Oh, okay.
That's my name.
Okay. No, Valeria. Yes.
Going back to, and I have to say, I taught down at Santa Teresa High School for a year down in 2007-8, so I kind of have a little bit of background on this too, and have seen some of what you were saying, but I find it interesting when you had said that they have a sense of duty to do well in class. Did you notice any of that? I wonder if there's a correlation between the boys and the girls there as well.
Wow, that's a good question. You know, we have never looked at that.
Right.
That's something that.
Yeah, because I mean, I definitely saw that when I was teaching in the high school, was definitely the girls that, and then that evolution of what you had mentioned the glorification among the boys, and the resistance to, you know, that wanting to return to that way of life was definitely amongst the boys. So
Yeah. That's a good question,
yeah.
right? That's something we need to.
Yeah, did the girls have good academic ambitions then?
Yes, and
Okay.
even the boys did. All of them had good academic, and they were great students.
Okay.
Yeah, except that when they talked about violence, they talked about it very differently. We also saw transfronterizo knowledge, crossing borders, so we saw a lot of the things that they were learning in Juarez, they were transferring over to El Paso schools, going to the funds of knowledge, the community cultural wealth. We saw Pepe and Jonathan, they talked a lot about religious literacy, so they would go back on the weekends, particularly on Sunday, to catequismo. They would go to church, they would go to catechism, they would read a lot about religious, the Bible, religious readings. Rosa, Olga, and Amanda, all of them, always brought comic books. Those comic books from Juarez, they were always reading those. They were always reading the newspaper comics and talking about them in the classroom. And they would use some of this material that they got from the comics in their own writing and in their own role play. When the teacher would have them role play something, they would use a lot of their knowledge of comics, a lot of their knowledge of novelas and Mexican films in their role play. Jacqueline talked a lot about the luchas, the wrestling, both in Juarez, in Mexico, and in the United States. And she almost always compared and contrasted the difference between the Mexican luchas and the wrestling here in the United States. Esa kept a poemario, and not only her, we saw a lot of the little girls, like the boys kept narcocorrido journals, the girls kept a lot of journals of poems. Poems that they would write themselves or poems that they would get from the media or from moms or family members. And they would always be sharing their poems. And here we were looking mostly at literacy and how literacy was transferring over from Mexico to the United States. Jonathan, which I mentioned him briefly a while ago, he was very popular because of his narcocorrido notebook. It was really big. And if you would look at it, all it contained was narcocorrido songs. It was the lyrics to the narcocorridos. He was not the only one. There was some females who had narcocorrido notebooks, but not as much as the boys. And then Valeria talked a lot about recipe notebooks, novelas, and Mexican films, and we saw this a lot, especially when they were role-playing the social studies. They would always bring in the Mexican films. Así es que lo dice whoever it was, or the novelas. They would always make relations or comparisons to the novelas. My finding in particular are the lost opportunities in the social studies classroom. And when I was writing my field notes and analyzing my data, I saw a lot of lost opportunities in the social studies to create a critical perspective, to create a critical dialogue and analysis of what they were reading and studying. This in particular, this is an example of Ms. G's class. They were discussing the Holocaust, and they were preparing to read Milkweed by Jerry Spinelli. And this is what Ms. G said. They were talking, the word ghetto came out in the book, and they started to talk about the word ghetto. The student said, son cholos. Why do you say que son cholos?
What's cholos mean?
A cholo is like, I guess the best description is a homie. You've seen the homies, the bandana, the flannel shirt with the, yeah, I guess that's it.
But a ghetto is a geographic location, and they're comparing that to a person.
Right. And a ghetto person is a person who has no education, says Roberto, right? And Ms. G says, okay, let's go there. When I was sitting there and she said, let's go there, I was like, yeah, I was getting excited, let's go there. But then all she did was, they didn't go to school, uneducated. What does it mean? Students respond, a bad person, ugly, hobo, a cholo. Ms. G.